Dark Souls and Hyper Light Drifter will assault you, confuse you, and punish you. They occupy the same space in the gaming world. The dark, brutally difficult, yet endlessly rewarding game that displays how well-crafted game design can elevate the classic action role-playing archetype. They can be viewed as homologous games, obviously not in structure or technicality, but definitely in how they make us feel and how we interact with them. But before we begin, I'll address some obvious comparisons between the two games. The cruel and uncompromising combat systems. Easy to learn, yet hard to master. The no safety net style environmental design. You can and you will fall off ledges, you will get lost, you will get frustrated, and you will backtrack. The wealth of hidden areas and exploration. The murderous boss battles. A planned and precisely executed strategy will make you successful in both games. Patience is learned, rewarded, and encouraged. Reckless aggressiveness is the quickest way to be killed, yet the fastest way to beat the game if you can master it. The dark art style, nebulous lore, and haunting musical score promote appetites for prolonged and repeat play sessions. These successes are how we remember and experience both Dark Souls and Hyper Light Drifter. This video serves to intimately deconstruct how the application of its design supports those achievements, but more interestingly, how each game achieves it on its own, and often in completely different ways. Dark Souls and HLD are games that cohesively bring together the three pillars that most modern games stand upon: sound, world and level design, and gameplay. In these two games, each of these three areas are so interconnected and in support of one another that it almost feels like sacrilege to deconstruct them. They support one another and make each better than they would have been on their own. You may know it quoted masterfully from Aristotle: "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." I call it the Hyper Light Souls effect.
That one day an undead shall be chosen.
Dark Souls and Hyper Light Drifter have sound designs that evoke similar feelings of loneliness, hopelessness, destitution, and dread, but each game develops these attributes in their own unique ways. Dark Souls has some of the most masterfully crafted sound design in any video game I've ever played. The auditory experience in Dark Souls is the product of when tiny details and stunning silence clash with selectively chosen, strong sound assets. Whether it's walking, fighting, the deafening crack of when your sword meets an enemy shield, or the chilling ring of a church bell. Every sound feels thick and necessary. This feeling of weight is only amplified when you line up these sound assets next to Dark Souls' otherwise silent and muted world. What you don't hear in a game is often just as important as what you do hear. The first thing that pops into my head when I think about a Dark Souls game is not an image, but it's a sound. The comforting hum of the crackling bonfire is a sound like no other in a game. In a game such as Dark Souls, that prides itself as being musically minimalist, every sound counts. The bonfire is the warm constant in a world otherwise covered in darkness and destitution. The gasping sound of consuming an Estus flask, another sound effect I cannot seem to forget. You feel the relief it offers, especially when it's your last flask and you're far from a bonfire. And who could forget the sound of death in Dark Souls? Dire and dismay at first, only to become so routine that the shrill cry of death becomes the norm in Dark Souls. A minimalist yet powerful sound design allows the world of Dark Souls to breathe and feel more open, while at the same time accentuate the individual sound assets in use. The same can be said for its musical score. The developers crafted something truly wonderful here with the music in Dark Souls, guided by such deft and subdued hands. The bleakness offered by Firelink Shrine's musical score, or the orchestral and haunting music of Ornstein and Smo, Each track seems to jump out at you in a game otherwise full with such musical emptiness. Other music in the game speaks to the lore of Dark Souls, the inevitable decay of everyone and everything surrounding Lordran. The world of Lordran is thin, and death is within reach of us all, friend, player, or foe. Tracks like the Moonlight Butterfly and Gwen's Song capitalize on these mournful emotions by delivering slower, more chilling music. It's as if the tracks themselves are on the verge of becoming hollow, with the cries and the sorrowful chanting of the unknown women singing in the background, lamenting the fragileness of their own existence and the world of Dark Souls. The best part about all of this is that the sound design in Dark Souls is delicate, precisely placed and suspended above its silent world simply to support it when the time comes, and then to quietly retreat away as if it was never there in the first place. Like the NPCs you'll meet on your journey in Dark Souls, it's only passing by, and before you know it, it's gone.
So go now, and thank you.
In Hyper Light Drifter, the sound design follows mostly the same formula. The game begins with an ominous melody, slowly building before the reveal of a strange void creature, which then plays what I can only describe as a cerebral ringing. The game continues to use that sound throughout at key moments, and since it's so distinct and they only use it when the void creature appears, the sound itself becomes the symbol for death and danger in HLD. Just like the bonfire in Dark Souls, it's used as a constant in Hyper Light Drifter. Anytime I hear that sound, I can vividly picture him. The actual gameplay sounds are few in Hyper Light Drifter, but what you do hear, you remember. This is because Hyper Light Drifter processes sound effects in multiple layers like many smart games. Heart Machine released an in-depth suite of videos called The Sound of Hyper Light Drifter that showcases this very feature. Adding together multiple sounds sometimes can yield unexpected and very original results that identify them with a certain world. Hyper Light Drifter succeeds with this. The sound of your saber slashing through the air. The unique dash and warping sounds. The sound of the railgun, and simply even opening doors and hitting switches. Each action has a specific sound, so much that if you've played the game before, you can tell what's going on by the sound effects alone. The background music in HLD is incredibly subtle. It's always there, but it's similar to how wind passes through the trees to set ambience and mood. During boss battles, however, the music moves to the forefront of the audio spectrum. It's a good example of how to use proper musical spacing in a game, exemplified by the bird boss fight music. Thumping bass accompanies retro-sounding synthesizers, a music track that simply feels more intense because the rest of Hyper Light Drifter's world is so musically sparse. Again, it's very similar to the impact that music has in Dark Souls on its world. Another interesting thing about HLD is that there is no visible language, and that means when people speak, they speak in pictures and symbols. Without language, it's almost completely up to the player to decipher what is happening in the game space by using the sound effects HLD offers. As such, the removal of text, language, and dialogue makes the audio cues, and in turn the sound design, even more important and relevant. The job of a game is to dream of a story for the space in which the player will inhabit, populate it with meaningful story, and design potential paths for players to take through the use of that space. Obviously, Dark Souls set out to craft its world in a very different way than most contemporary games of its time. In replace of traditional levels, an endless open world, quest markers, or scripted linearity, Dark Souls instead relies on us to tell the story through its gameplay instead. The world of Dark Souls is designed as an interconnected labyrinth of gameplay areas tied together by a spiderweb of traps, locked doors, shortcuts, and secret passageways. Although it's known for being a very difficult game, a more refined look at the design of its world and levels shows a much more practical reason for its obtuseness. After being dropped off at Firelink Shrine via strange creepy bird, players quickly realize that this will be their first and only home for a very, very long time. Giving you a home as the first stop as a way out of the tutorial area is not an insignificant gesture. From Firelink Shrine all the way to Anor Londo, the first half of the game exists as one continuous level. Yes, of course, there are different areas with strange names, bridges and doorways and passages leading to new places, but there are no breaks. The beauty of the first half of the game is that you'll often circle back to areas you've been to before, but from different angles or completely different directions entirely. You'll discover new passageways that interconnect with other routes, old and new, and it begins to dawn on you after a while that you have the power to navigate this world freely without any barrier. This interconnectedness creates a very seamless experience in Dark Souls. There are no loading screens, no waiting periods, every moment can feel tense because of it. You won't feel at home, and at no point other than the Firelink Shrine will you feel completely at ease. Firelink Shrine is your only home in Dark Souls. And because the world wraps around itself like a snake, you'll often feel the gentle tug and pull of pacing as you venture out from the shrine, seeing how far you can go, either before you run into another bonfire or return back home, or in other cases, how you're swiftly led back to the shrine after completing major milestones. Unlike Hyperlight Drifter, Dark Souls does not give you a map to figure all this out, but it does do something subtle to steer you in the right direction from the very beginning of the game. The beauty of the world design in Dark Souls is that you are taught 4 very simple yet harsh lessons that the game does not want you to forget, without you even realizing it. At the very start of the game, you have for the most part 3 choices. You can go up the hill to the north, to the Undead Burg, the obvious choice for beginners. You can go down the stairs to New Londo, or you can head up to the left bank in search of the cemetery and the catacombs. Dying in the graveyard or in New Londo is not uncommon, so most players will ultimately find themselves stumbling up the stairs and tunnels towards the Undead Burg. By this very simple design, Dark Souls wants you to remember that many routes and options exist for various skill levels, and that there may be another way if you just keep looking. The cemetery is deceptively treacherous with its endless armies of skeletons, sheer hanging cliffs, and nightmarish black cave systems, but many players will be lured there by shiny white orbs littering the ground. Shiny things are attractive, and they serve as temptations that toy with the minds of new players and beg them to suicide for their treasures. It's a common theme that exists in most areas of the game. How many players have died again and again running for that Zweihanda? Who knows, but like all good lessons and strength of learning, most players will learn to avoid item death running as they mature, as the cost of death can be tremendous at later stages of the game. And because souls are literal gold to new players, they will learn this lesson very quickly. The path to the Taurus Demon is only a short jog up some rubble and a few castle staircases from the Undead Burg bonfire, but it is here that Dark Souls teaches you another lesson that it hopes you learn now and not later. Most players will die several times up to and during the boss fight, and potentially lose many souls in the process. But once you know the enemy placements in Dark Souls, the path from the bonfire to the boss can be sprinted to with no fighting and very few complications. It's very possible to get to the Taurus Demon and skip every single enemy encounter on the way up. Bosses in Dark Souls are designed to take multiple attempts, and there's no question that this can produce a pacing problem by forcing players to re-clear enemies on the way up to those glowing fog doors. Many new players bemoan the frustrations of dying to a boss and having to re-clear an entire area to get back up to it, only to show up with next to no Estus flasks. But by teaching you early that enemy positions do not change, it is possible to avoid combat and progress through the game with proper awareness. Soon after defeating the Taurus Demon, players will find themselves on the Hellkite Bridge. A fire-breathing dragon sits at the end of the bridge, ready to engulf the player with fire as soon as he or she walks across. It's a nearly unavoidable death, and designed to teach you the third lesson in Dark Souls: never assume the path you're on is the correct one, and always be on your guard. The purpose of your fiery death is to increase the tension surrounding your decision to look for alternative routes, question if it's even the right place to be, and ultimately find Solaire looking over a majestic sunset in the background. It supports the idea that players should never feel very comfortable or completely oriented while playing Dark Souls, which is the foundation for the tension the game is embodied with. These 4 lessons, built in directly to the world design of Dark Souls, are required to learn in order to master the game. They are never spoken of, never asked or told to you, but simply experienced by engaging with the design of Lordran. Just by interacting with the world, you form the foundation for becoming a good Souls player. Surprises in world design do exist in Dark Souls, but when you discover them, you see that they were never meant to be surprises in the first place. Dark Souls always gives you clues, whether you see them or not. A quintessential example of this is the giant standing atop the roof above the entrance to Sen's fortress. Most players will never fight that giant, nor ever find means to. Neither did I, until I unexpectedly survived a deadly fall from the first bridge in Sen's fortress while trying to capture some footage for this video. Take a look at my idiot ass falling from this bridge, landing just within sight of a doorway amidst the black sticky sludge leading to a ladder. After frantically scurrying up it, I was led to yet another ladder and ultimately the stage at which the lumbering giant sat patiently. Had I been paying attention to the previous cutscene, I would have spotted the giant sitting at that very spot, and judging from how many stairs led up to the bridge where I stupidly stumbled off of, I should have easily been able to ascertain from that cutscene that the giant was roughly at the same elevation as me, and hence be able to find him if I really wanted to. It's just another small example of how Dark Souls' world design, for the most part, makes complete sense and really draws you into the game. This picture stands out to me as something truly beautiful. A proud-looking man, neon sword in hand, standing on the precipice of a stone hill, gazing towards red-eyed demons. With his cape billowing in the wind, he stands, dwarfed by the monsters as the chilling music screeches in the background. Such solitude, dread, and bravery captured in a single frame without saying a goddamn word. And that is how Hyperlight Drifter presents itself when you enter the game. At the start of HLD, you are placed in a town, very similar to Firelink, that is the center of the game's world. Even though you begin the game with a map, you still have no clue as to which way to go to start your journey. Although HLD has 4 sections, each zone does a great job at specializing in its own theme and making them feel very distinct. At the beginning, it can feel like a 4-way maze. If you venture into the forest, you'll be met with gorilla-ish brutes. Heading to the water area and you'll find these ninja froggy things, and going to the mountains will get you attacked by sorcerer birds. The main goal of the game is to collect mysterious spheres, which eventually open up the area to the final boss. You'll have to do quite a lot of searching to figure out where they are, as the game offers very little hand-holding. Coupled with the aforementioned eerie and empty sound design, this constraint can often make you feel quite lonely and very isolated too, a similar feeling surrounding the journey through Dark Souls. The main difference of how Dark Souls and HLD design their worlds is that HLD gives you a map. Although the map is rudimentary and vague at best, verbal clues exist from another drifter who marks objectives on your map, a simple mechanic offered to you at least to give you some semblance of orientation that is otherwise lacking in Dark Souls. Most new players will be begging for a map in Dark Souls, a signpost, hell anything to show them where to go. The map won't serve much help as far as guiding you through specific areas in HLD, but it does at the very least give you a direction to go. One of the hardest things that I had to get used to in Dark Souls was a lack of a map and that dense sense of verticality. With all the intricate shortcuts in the game, it's surprisingly hard to wrap your head around how the world is interconnected. You sometimes find yourself struggling to remember how you got to certain areas you've previously been. However, in Souls games, the 3D space can be viewed as more forgiving and less in need of a map, as evident by the ability to offer various subtle cues during cutscenes or with dialogue. Let's think back to Sen's Fortress in Dark Souls as a prime example. After successfully beating the Chaos Witch Quelaag and ringing the second bell, the player walks back to Firelink's shrine and finds the Firekeeper murdered. Although many will stare at the shrine in consternation without the ability to save, or worse, the knowledge of where to go, Dark Souls offered players 3 cues leading up to this moment, all pointing towards Sen's Fortress as the next leg of your journey. Number 1, the cutscene after ringing the second bell literally shows it to you if you remember what the gate looks like. Number 2, Framp tells you if you talk to him,
"Those who seek the realm of lords must brave Sen's Fortress."
And number 3, but most importantly, the game has ensured that the only place you feel safe now is the parish bonfire, which is directly in view of the Fortress Gate. This is a great example of why HLD may have decided to include a map having the handicap of not being able to explore these visual mechanics as easily. I think a lot of us will agree that the defining emotion of Dark Souls is the thrill of facing both harsh challenges and overcoming those obstacles. The game succeeds in its design because it does everything it can do to provide both of those experiences. Most people remember their first playthrough of Dark Souls to be intimately punishing. The Asylum Demon is the cornerstone roadblock for a lot of new players. This is the hallmark of how Souls games approach pacing. Front-load most of the struggle to make sure that the player's skills are at least somewhat ship-shape for the next areas. This technique ensures players can explore future areas without being hamstrung by an inability to defend themselves and progress through the game as it introduces new enemies, challenges, and traps. This is a common theme and is repeated in its sequels, as with the very first boss in Dark Souls 3, Ludic's Gundyr. The gameplay recipe in Dark Souls is 1 part combat, 1 part exploration, and a sprinkle of inventory and character management. The ultimate success of Dark Souls' gameplay shows light in the interaction between the Estus and bonfire systems. Unlike future iterations of the series, Dark Souls' bonfires felt adequately spaced out, difficult yet fair to reach, and placed smartly in relation to boss doors. The main goal of the game is to entice you to venture out to a point where you have to stop and ask yourself the hard question: should I turn back or should I push on? How many of us have stopped knee-deep in the maze of Blighttown or halfway through the darkness of the catacombs and said, fuck it, I'm heading back to my last bonfire, ain't no way in hell I want to lose these souls. Many of those players find themselves in repeat scenarios where it's just as smart to turn back for fear of losing souls as it is to push on and continue forward to find that future bonfire. Such is the beauty of Dark Souls. And because the world design of Dark Souls is so cohesively cryptic, and you aren't supplied a map, you never truly know what's around the next corner, what kinds of horrors are lurking in the shadows, or what pitfalls you may stumble into. Everything is a risk in Dark Souls because of this, and everything has a trade-off. The healing system of Dark Souls shines brightest during these moments. The Estus system was designed purposefully to play with the idea of managing the effectiveness of each potion. Many creatures in Dark Souls can kill you with a single hit if your HP pool is too low, so it's often smart to top yourself off before venturing into unknown places. But when your Estus counts are low, you'll be forced to ask yourself if you should use the flask now or wait until you've taken more damage to maximize its effect. Wasting any portion of an Estus flask, it feels horrible in Dark Souls. It sucks, especially when you're in a pinch. The result is an elegant dance of resource management that makes you feel consistently uncomfortable because you're never truly able to effectively use the one free resource that you're given. Add all that together and it's easier to enter a flow-like state in Dark Souls, where outside distractions are ignored and complete concentration is given to the game. It's because Dark Souls demands unwavering attention. Flow states are in themselves rewarding, but Dark Souls offers no break from such mental states as it never lets up. The deep healing system and careful bonfire placements create such tense cat-and-mouse gameplay as a result. Combat in Dark Souls itself focuses on one-on-one engagements, and its gameplay mechanics support it. Once inputted, combat animations cannot be cancelled. Thus, you're at the mercy of your own patience in Dark Souls. You are your worst enemy at times, as combat can be summed up as a careful dance akin to a game of chess. Now this gameplay extends to the most controversial, yet what I believe to be the most essential feature in Dark Souls: invasions. To many new players, the thought of having enemy players enter their world is horrifying, another obstacle roadblocking an already cripplingly hard adventure. But Namco implemented the PvP very carefully, as consuming humanity in Dark Souls does offer you several benefits that compensate for having to deal with invasions. So in the end, players must choose if all of those benefits outweigh the cost of being invaded. Humanity is scarce, and if you die, you do lose it all. Invasions are a very memorable experience because of how they tie themselves back to the thematics of Dark Souls. Dark Souls is a game about death. unfairness, and obtuseness, supported both by its world and sound design as we already discussed. Invasions only serve to amplify this sense of dread by further tipping the odds out of your favor. Most of the time, it's just not fair. But therein lies the beauty of the invasion system. You see, if you die during an invasion, most of the time you actually won't feel that bad, because it was never fair in the first place. But if you do slay your invaders, you feel goddamn fantastic. Hence, invasions in Dark Souls become a win-win formula for providing tension in the game and supporting the other elements overall. Much like Dark Souls, combat in Hyper Light Drifter ties in beautifully with its world design. As discussed earlier, with so little information given to the player, HLD has to convey as much as possible through immediate visual cues. So we can safely say players have been taught to piece together the story and the character interactions through the use of symbols and animation, as there is no dialogue in Hyper Light Drifter. It's in this fashion that the game has trained you to be focused and inquisitive while playing. Hyper Light Drifter practices fairness in gameplay through deconstructing the tutorial process. In an industry full of hand-holding and painfully crippling tutorial concessions, HLD leans towards showing you and not telling you. Combat scenarios in HLD are puzzles because you have to figure out the best approach to handle multiple enemy types, groupings, and attack variations. Each of these monsters requires you to adjust your way of fighting. For the gorillas, a quick strike in and out approach works best. But for the frogs, you're going to have to learn to dash and dodge their ninja stars, or if you're good, you can slash them back at them. But for the birds, when you see them queue up that laser, you need to dodge, and then you can counterattack. So you need to adjust your playstyle based on each situation, just like in Dark Souls, and that's where the skill comes in. Combat becomes increasingly difficult as the game progresses, throwing in not only more enemies, but a lot more variety. If you thought fighting 10 gorillas was hard, then fighting 10 gorillas with 3 wolves is going to be a nightmare. And because each enemy has the optimal way of being killed, it becomes very difficult when you have multiple types of enemies. It gives you more things to process on the fly and think about, thus the difficulty becomes exponential. And on top of all of that, we need to talk about upgrades too with those precious gear bits. If you bought sword deflection, then maybe you prefer to be more of a timid player, focusing on waiting for the enemy to attack first and then sending his attacks flying back at him. Or maybe you dropped your upgrades on the shotgun. That works just fine too. There's also a stim pack system that's very similar to the Estus potion system in Dark Souls, but you're limited to 3 packs at first in Hyper Light Drifter, which you can upgrade to 5 later on if you so choose. And since combat is so difficult, you will likely be getting hit a lot, and these gems will be well worth their weight in gold. Refills are scarce too. As with Dark Souls, choosing when to use your stim packs is of vital importance, as you'll often find yourself in situations where you cannot maximize the efficiency of each dose. While dying in Hyper Light Drifter is much less punishing than Dark Souls, dying does mean you have to start at the beginning of the area again, and some of these areas are pretty freaking big and long and difficult, so dying is by no means trivial, it still sucks. I often refer to Dark Souls and Hyper Light Drifter as 2 brothers born from different parents. Each can make you cry, both stories need to be pieced together with imagination, and difficulty is impregnated within the heart of each. I truly believe Dark Souls and Hyper Light Drifter, much like Mario or Zelda, will never cease to be talked about. They are both stunning games that play with our minds in the late hours of the night. Sure, they have their problems, but the sound, world, and gameplay are so well fashioned as a whole as to make the final games even more stunning than they would otherwise be. A perfect example of the Hyper Light Souls effect. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, by all means hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of video, because there's more coming in the future, and have a kick-ass day.